Hello to everyone, very welcome. I am Walter Omar Kohan, now full professor at the State University of Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. And I think my main thing to present myself in this panel is by saying that I was the first one to be mentored by Matthew Lipman in my PhD in philosophy when we were fellows with Maughn Gregory, and that was 1996 that I defended. It was a dissertation entitled, very close to this session, Thinking about Philosophy in the Education of Children. And we are here for the session Matthew Lipman and the Educational Role of Philosophy. And this is also part of the forthcoming book, Philosophy for Children, in the collection Philosophy for Children Founders. The book is entitled Matthew Lipman and the Educational Role of Philosophy, published by Routledge. So I pass the word to Maughn Gregory.
Thanks, Walter. Okay, I'm going to share my screen. So we have some slides. So there's Matthew Lipman. And thanks everyone for being with us for this panel presentation on our book. And as Walter said, this book is in the series, The Philosophy for Children Founders, from Routledge. And there's a picture of the book on the right there. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 brief presentations, and then after which Walter will give some reflection, and then we'll have some time for discussion. So to begin with, Megan and I are going to introduce the book by talking about Matthew Lipman, the man himself. So Megan?
Thanks, Maughn. So we have 2 slides on Matthew Lipman's biography, and you can see here that he was sort of in the US infantry he was born in New Jersey, and then he was in the infantry between the years of 1943 and 1946. And that's important because it's the GI Bill that then pays for his 4 years at Columbia University. And he was able at Columbia to do his undergraduate education and later his graduate education. He was determined to complete it all within the 4 years that was funded by the GI Bill. He actually ended up completing the dissertation while he was at the Sorbonne on a Fulbright scholarship for 2 years. And the dissertation was called Problems of Art Inquiry. And it focuses on the art making process. And in particular, it was sort of informed by an exchange that he had with Dewey about a paper he'd written on Dewey and tertiary qualities. And so he shared it with Dewey, and Dewey congratulated him on the paper, said it was interesting and informative, and that really was what inspired Matt to decide to focus his dissertation research on the problems of art inquiry or qualitative thinking. He, from having completed the dissertation and returned from his Fulbright in Paris, he was appointed an assistant professor at the College of Pharmaceutical Sciences, which was affiliated with Columbia University. And it was there that he rose through the ranks from assistant, associate, and full. And he then became chair of the general education department at the pharmacy college, or the school college. While he was at the pharmacy college, he was also teaching at a range of other institutions in the New York City area. He moved to Montclair in 1972 when the College of Pharmacy closed. It was there that he met Anne Sharp and founded the Institute for the Advancement of Philosophy for Children. And they founded a journal at that time. A little later, the Thinking, the Journal of Philosophy for Children. And they began to come to the attention of mainstream philosophy, as evidenced by the American Philosophical Association and Philosophy Documentation Center Prize for Excellence and Innovation in Philosophy programs. So there's a lot of period in there where he's teaching and writing and publishing and traveling and disseminating philosophy for children. He retires and then dies in 2010 in West Orange, New Jersey.
Thanks. So I'm going to talk for just a minute now about his philosophical influences, and we've narrowed it down to two major categories: the philosophical and psychological. So philosophically, he was read widely, and he was influenced by many different kinds of schools of philosophy, but he really focused on, we think these were his major influences, were the pragmatists, especially from Charles Peirce. He got the idea that philosophy itself is a kind of inquiry, and like the sciences and like mathematics, that kind of inquiry is strongest when it's practiced in a community. As Megan said, he had personal correspondence and visited with John Dewey, and he really credits Dewey with being one of the most important influences of his own thinking, especially Dewey's own theory of inquiry, which parallels that of Peirce in many ways, and as Megan mentioned, his aesthetic theory. And I'll just mention one of the most important aspects of Dewey's aesthetic theory is that aesthetic qualities are parts of ordinary experience, and we should not think of them as segregated, like when you go to a museum, you have an aesthetic experience and the rest of your life doesn't. And that was really formative for Matt. So he came to think of ethical and political as dimensions of ordinary experience, and later he came to see that as part of including children. Children's ordinary experience has these same qualities. And then Justice Buckler was the American philosopher at Columbia. He chaired the philosophy department there for a number of years, and he also chaired the general education program at Columbia. It was Buckler who hired Lipman to teach some courses in the philosophy department, but also to be full-time at the College of Pharmacy, as Megan said. And Buckler's own philosophy was very formative for Lipman, particularly his theory of human judgment, which for Buckler, everything we say, everything we make, and everything we do is a judgment. So judgment pervades all human life, really. But judgment can be either the result of non-thinking and just like habit and even subconscious judgments, or it can be judgment as the result of inquiry or query, and be methodical, and as Buckler said, in the interrogative mode. When we're making, saying, and doing in the interrogative mode, we're doing it as a form of query, and that was important for Lipman. And also Buckler's theory of discussion, the discussion method of teaching, in which he said you can have a legitimate philosophical query that happens just through talk in a classroom. And in fact, that's the only kind of teaching that really helps students to construct their own understandings of things. And then in psychology, Matt was very interested in psychology, read widely in psychology, and he was particularly informed by George Herbert Mead's view of the self as a social being, and Piaget's constructivist theory, particularly the part about assimilation and accommodation, where when you run into a novel experience that your beliefs don't cope with, you have to reaccommodate your belief systems, and that was formative for Matt's idea of education. And of course, Vygotsky's social learning theory, which Alina's going to talk about at length. And also Jerome Bruner's idea that Jerome Bruner was an American educational psychologist, and he's, among other things, famous for the idea that any subject can be taught with integrity to children of almost any age, that there's a way to do that. And so he had this idea of a spiral curriculum where you introduce young children to the fundamentals of history and science and philosophy, and then you, in a spiral, you revisit those at a more sophisticated level as they get older. But even from the beginning, it has integrity, and they're actually learning those subjects. And I'm going to turn it back to Megan.
Thanks, Maughn. So we just wanted to document here for you just where Matt Lipman was teaching during the time that he was at the College of Pharmacy, and just how much teaching he was doing during this period. So even though he was full-time at the College of Pharmacy and was moving through the ranks, he was also engaged in teaching in these other institutions for shorter and longer periods. And some of them involved him in teaching adults at night, so sort of less typical students. And the reason he had so many teaching commitments at this time is because a lot of these places were implementing general education for the first time, and they needed sort of instructors in general education, or the subjects in general education, including philosophy. Many of their general education requirements were modeled on the Columbia University, Columbia College core, which comprised some courses that you'll see reflected in his courses that he created. So what we also wanted to sort of show is just the extent to which Matt at the time was engaged in teaching general or liberal education to a range of diverse students, students of pharmacology, students of music, adult education students, and of course he would come to think about the education of students. And one of the things he was preoccupied with at this time is how to reach these students by means of liberal education, because they often did not take to it as readily as the students at Columbia College did. And he was convinced that if he could find the right way to engage them, he would, be able to create the kind of access to liberal education that he wanted to create. So you'll see that he experiments with different types of courses and also very different types of text as well. These are some of the courses that he designed for the College of Pharmacy, and you can see that initially, at least, he began with a course that looked very much like the general education course at Columbia College, which was a combination of contemporary civilization and contemporary Western literature. From there, Matt went on to design a series of courses that ranged from everything from the arts to the fine arts, to logic, to scientific method, to theories of knowledge, to political ideologies. So he was constantly finding a way to reach the students, to adapt what he'd learned from teaching at Columbia College for these different populations of students and different contexts and different interests.
And these are just some photos. Yeah. These are some photos that we've dug up from, mostly from yearbooks of the College of Pharmacy and a few other places. On the bottom left, it's important. We haven't talked about his family life much in this presentation. We do write about that in the book. But when Matt was on the boat to Paris for his Fulbright scholarship, he met his first wife, Winona Moore, who was also a Fulbright scholar to study French at the Sorbonne. And when they got to Paris, they began dating, and they married in Paris. She was from Atlanta, and she had actually been a tutor of Martin Luther King at one of the colleges in Atlanta. But of course, it was against the law for interracial marriage to happen in Atlanta, so they couldn't get married there. And so they were married in Paris, and they had 2 children. And the education of his mixed race children was another important factor in Lipman's thinking about education. And I'll just also say that on the bottom right, you see him in crutches, and we'll explain why that's important in just a moment. So, as Megan was saying, during this time, almost 20 years, he spent teaching in New York City. He was experimenting with different ways to try to bring a liberal arts education and the experience of inquiry and thinking to this wide variety of students, adult education students and music students and pharmacy students who were not, shall we say, in a standard academic track. And one of the ways was this discussion method of teaching that I mentioned that he learned from Justice Buckler. And as Megan said, he experimented. He used all kinds of different texts, including poetry and drama that he brought into the classroom, and artwork and music. Matt wrote a textbook, an introduction to philosophy textbook that was published in '69, the first edition, called Discovering Philosophy. And in that book, he has excerpts of texts from philosophers through history, but then they're arranged thematically. And at the end of each thematic section, Matt wrote an original fictional dialogue among those philosophers that you had just read excerpts from. And so in the book that we're publishing, we have one example of that. It's a dialogue between St. Augustine and Kierkegaard and Hume on theories of knowledge that Matt just invented. So the idea of dramatizing philosophy to make it accessible and to pattern the thinking began way back then. And he also put together 2 art exhibitions. Thank you, Walter. 2 art exhibitions, one at the College of Pharmacy and one was in a bank lobby in Manhattan. And this was partly, he was so interested in art, something he never get up, and he dabbled in painting himself. And it was also partly, he started to have some kind of dissatisfaction with his teaching career. Like he was running around, commuting for all these different places, and he kind of wanted to do something different. And so art exhibitions was one of the ways he did that. Now I don't have the date here, but in the late '60s, Matt slipped on some ice and broke his ankle, and he spent about over a week in the hospital. And while he was there, he read a novel by Stendhal in which one of the characters makes some kind of bold existential move that changes the trajectory of their life. And Matt, in his autobiography, said, at that moment, I realized I have to change my life. I need to change my life. He's already around 50, like in his early 50s at this point, and he's had almost 20 years of teaching, and he decided I need something completely different to do with my life. And so the move to Montclair was to pursue philosophy for children was how that happened. But there were many other factors that brought him to that point where he made that momentous decision. One of the early ones was with an exchange with Hannah Arendt, who in 1954, when the United States Supreme Court made the decision, Brown versus Board of Education, where they made the racial segregation of schools, public schools in the United States, illegal. Hannah Arendt wrote an article criticizing that. And Matt was surprised and kind of enraged by her article. So Dissent magazine journal published a series of responses to her, and they invited him to write a response, which he did, but because of the timing, it was never published. But they sent it to her, and she read it, and she wrote a lengthy response to Matt, which we have. Unfortunately, we don't have his original essay responding to her, but we have her response to him, in which she really appreciates his thoughtfulness and disagrees with him all over again, and it's quite interesting. But he said that was one of the first things that made him start thinking about children's rights in education. And then in 1968, the student protests at Columbia. It's a very complicated story, but there was a white group of students that were protesting the Vietnam War, the SDS group, and there was a black group of students that were protesting Columbia's building of a proposal to build a gym. And Matt said they were, thank you, Walter. Matt said he realized at that point the administration and the students were unreasonable and education needed to start happening a lot earlier. And as Megan mentioned, he also knew that the College of Pharmacy was going to be closed in a few years. So he was actually looking for someplace else. As we know, he went on to write several philosophical novels for children, which we'll be talking about. And he did a lot of theory as well. He wrote theoretical books on education and philosophy that people will be referring to later on. These are some photos of his later years in life. And look at who's on the bottom right there.
Yeah.
It's our friend Walter. Being guided by Matt, or having a discussion with Matt, as he said, during his doctoral work. All right, Steve Williams could not be here with us today. We just have 2 slides on Steve's chapter in the book, and Megan's going to do the first.
Yeah, I think what we wanted to share with you is that this chapter thinks a lot about Lipman's decision to dramatize philosophy, and it thinks about it in a number of ways. It looks at the influences that he took from Diderot and Plato and other figures who had dramatized philosophy in the past. It thinks a little bit about the role of rhetoric in dramatized philosophy and makes the argument that Matt could have perhaps incorporated more of that, whereas he tended to focus more on reason and argument. And it also looks at the instructional manuals as also dramatized philosophy, but philosophy as lists, which is a fun section of the chapter. Given the time constraint, I don't think we'll go into the chronotopes, but that's also there in the chapter, influenced heavily by Bakhtin.
And we're out of time. I'll just say, in response to a number of criticisms written about Lipman and the way he did his novels, Steve Williams comes up with these new criteria for philosophical novels in the future. And I think Gil and Simone, are going to talk about some of those criticisms. So we will stop there. Thank you. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that Mark can be next.
In deference to my extreme old age, I'm going to read a paper. But before I do, I just want an interesting biographical touch. I had been a working musician, and I went to graduate school, and I became a graduate assistant at City College. And the first course I taught in 1968 was Matt Lipman's classic civ course in Mannes College of Music at 8 o'clock in the morning to a room of 15 sleeping musicians. In the beginning, Matthew Lipman created Harry Stottlemeier's discoveries, shaking Piagetian boundaries and embedding logic in the human imagination, dialogue, and a community of inquiries. His signature contribution, bringing philosophy to children, begins with an exchange that encapsulates his contribution to logic, signaling the revolution in teaching children that his exploration of logic engendered. His work teaching philosophy for children foreshadowed his contribution to understanding the role of critical thinking and inquiry. These rather disparate projects share a deep commitment to the embedding of logic and inquiry in human experience. And despite Lipman's focus on education, and especially the education of children, his analysis of critical thinking has great breadth, offering a perspective that transcends his explicit focus on philosophy of children and reaching towards a foundational framing of inquiry. We start at the beginning. Quote, "It probably wouldn't happen if Harry hadn't fallen asleep in science class that day. Well, he didn't really fall asleep either. His mind just wandered off." There it is in all its iconoclastic glory. A double, subjunctive, counterfactual statement, a declarative statement and then its denial. The meandering mind of the student described in the complex prose of the narrator, flying in the face of the standard construal of young people's capacities. And then the challenge from the teacher, quote, what is it that has a long tail and revolves about the sun every 77 years? And then disaster, error, and humiliation. Harry, taking a chance, says a planet, having missed Mr. Bradley saying, this thing with a tail also revolves around the sun, only it isn't a planet. And then an epiphany. So there are things that revolve around the sun that aren't planets, Harry said to himself. All planets revolve about the sun, but not everything that revolves about the sun is a planet. Solid, concrete, operational thinking. Logic by example, appropriate for the Piagetian middle school student. The next sentence, however, challenges Piagetian conceits, moving Harry towards formal logic and the discovery of a core logical principle. Quote, a sentence can't be reversed. If you put the last part of the sentence first, it will no longer be true. For example, take this sentence, all oaks are trees. If you turn it around, all trees are oaks. This then becomes the core of the logic presented in Harry, the basis for the introduction of logic to middle school students and their teachers, but unnoticed both in the text and in most discussions of the program, Harry has overgeneralized. Harry has not moved to fully formal thinking, for violating a formal logical rule does not move from truth to falsity, but rather the search for a necessary inference rule is blocked by possible falsity. This view of logic, seen as a theory of inference, where inference is standardly defined as a modal relationship between premise and conclusion, such that if the premises are true and the inference deductively valid, the conclusion must be true, was at the core of available logic texts. The metalogical point sets the stage for the appreciation of Lipman's effort as a pedagogical model and as an alternative conception of the role of logic in thinking. Rather than engaging in a developed statement of logical theory to support Harry's discovery, as would be the case in the available textbook literature, Lipman develops another approach entirely. Harry talks to his friends outside of school and in the classroom, where it becomes a joint endeavor of the student and the teacher, extending over time and leading to an explanation of both logic and many other subjects upon which the clear and thoughtful conversations are brought to bear. Lipman has created a fictional community of inquiry, operationalizing the insights of John Dewey that students learn best when learning within the social structures that children naturally inhabit. Lipman wants to revolutionize the classroom and particularly the role of teachers within it. This revolution in the role of teachers is supported by the Teacher's Manual, central to the faculty development efforts in which I participated for over a decade. As I participated in teacher training in P4C, weekly workshops with teachers created a parallel dialogue, referencing both their works with students and in response to modeling by myself in the teacher's classroom. Teachers' workshops used the manual to create this parallel dialogue, reflecting on the material in the text and the practice in the classroom based on the children's response to the fictional community of inquiry in the text and their own developing classroom inquiry process. Each chapter in Harry is supported by a selection of leading ideas developed in the manual by exercises and discussion plans. Each of these ideas are presented through rich, discursive, open-ended questions, but when we come to the logical principle itself, the nature of the exercises change, constructing standard form universal propositions from fragments, reversing universal statements in standard form. Logic is presented mechanically. There is no attempt to engage with the philosophical issues that Harry's rule might be seen to raise. This brings into question just how teachers are being introduced to logic. Is it just a tool, or does it have intrinsic interest? For the children in the novel, logic is a fascinating arena for exploration, but for the teachers, it seemed to be just a set of procedures to be correctly mastered. One might wonder about the theory of the construction of the manual as contrasted with the imaginative creation presented in the novel. Is it that the editors of the manual saw logic as mechanical, tedious in its quasi-formalism, or does it reflect a theory of what the teachers were capable of grasping and presenting to their students. The teachers never got logic was a familiar refrain among the insiders when I worked for the IAPC, or as the implicit message that logic is canonical and so must be correctly learned, that logic must be accepted as given rather than as an object of speculation and inquiry.
Sorry, Mark, you have 2 more minutes, right?
Okay, Harry and his friend found much wonder in logic. Sadly, little of that is translated into support material furnished by logic. What I do in the rest of the paper is I just look at his definition of critical thinking. Critical thinking is skillful, responsible thinking that facilitates good judgment because it relies on criterion, is self-corrected, and is sensitive to context. The importance of that is that this broad notion of critical thinking not only rejects the prevailing views of, say, Robert Ennis and Siegel, and moves from critical thinking not in terms of the product, which might be a belief or an action, but rather the process. The adverbial skillful thinking is what characterizes Lipman, and this reflects, again, the community of inquiry double dialogue, where scientists, for example, think critically both about their project and about their projects, and also about the way they're engaging in the project, so that inquiry is used both to perform a successful process, but also to engender a reflective process of self-criticism. Okay, I'm done.
Thank you so much, Mark. Maughn, do you follow the who is next? Okay, Jill and Simone.
Are we on then?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you to those joining us, and to Maughn and Megan for inviting us to contribute to this important work. Our presentation will provide an overview of Matthew Lipman's views on social education, followed by major critiques of his work, and concluding with our own response developed in collaboration with our colleague, Mary Graham, a Kumba Mary Waka Waka woman, philosopher and political scientist in Australia. Lipman's view on the relationship between education, philosophy and democracy can be distilled into his agenda for education to produce reasonable, critical, judicious and creative individuals, which is necessary, he said, for deliberative democracy. His vision includes teaching students to recognise and critique prejudices, stereotypes and conflicts in society, in their environment and within themselves. As a form of education for social justice, it is intended to allow students to engage with difficult concepts and reduce prejudice and conflict. 2 more slides down, Maughn, sorry about that. Lipman's emphasises that schools are important places for children to become self-critical and self-corrective, learning to recognise their own biases and destructive tendencies. He argues that reducing violence and achieving social reconstruction requires the examination and correction of unfair social, political and economic practices starting in schools. However, he also recognised that the kind of democratic education he envisaged is difficult to achieve, given humans' tendencies towards things like prejudice, self-deception, conflicting emotions, and the lack of respect for others. Another slide. Lipman argues that the community of inquiry seeks to establish an atmosphere of mutual respect, intellectual openness, freedom to question and criticise, and courage to confront whatever enigmas life has to offer, noting that children from disadvantaged backgrounds would benefit from such inquiry that would otherwise go unrecognised by traditional forms of education. He concludes that philosophy for children represents Dewey's vision of democratic education. Leonard Harris questions the liberal idea of political and social democracy shared by Dewey and Lipman. He argues that the community of inquiry does not guarantee a safe space for marginalised and oppressed groups in an unjust society, and that Lipman's novels perpetuate a certain white universalism that is assimilationist. Next slide, please. This brings us to two closely related criticisms of philosophy for children curriculum. First, the novels are unrelated to the lives of students who are not white, middle class, suburban, and heterosexual. And two, that philosophy for children does not directly address issues of social injustice. For these reasons, philosophy for children may still serve to perpetuate rather than interrogate key epistemic assumptions that characterize whiteness. That is, classroom resources that detextualize race, gender, sexuality, or social class deprive students of the ability to analyze power imbalances and historical injustices. Next slide, please. Lipman has also been criticised for not incorporating action as a necessary phase of children's philosophical inquiry. As our colleague Jennifer Bleasby argues, the fact that he does not extend the community of inquiry beyond classroom discussion undermines his Deweyan claim that the community of inquiry is an exemplar of democracy in action. She recommends integrating social reconstruction learning to orient philosophy towards social action that is more reflective, dialogical, and inquiry-based. This approach fits well with Dewey's experiential learning, that is, education as the ideal of continuous reconstruction of experience, an ideal which is marked off from education as preparation for a remote future. Next slide, please, Maughn. Lipman's belief in dialogue, guided by reasonableness, as central to democracy, also stands in need of investigation. As Darren Chetty points out, philosophy for children's practices fails to historically engage with, examine, and challenge prevailing notions of reasonableness, thereby establishing an epistemically gated community of inquiry that encapsulates whiteness. Walter Kohan further adds that we need to reconsider the way our philosophical practices affirm education as political and to inhabit a different rationality, one committed to equality, difference, and to justice and freedom. Regardless of Lipman's optimism, the community of inquiry is not immune to epistemic bias or silencing, and as Simone will argue, epistemic violence. So over to you.
Thanks,
Simone.
Gil. So Lipman argued that one of the functions
slide.
of dialogue was to provide, quote, an understanding of how others understand us, especially when they think we have treated them offensively. Ultimately, violence will be reduced by the reasonable adjudication of these claims. It is in the classroom that these claims can first be articulated. However, as Gil mentioned, the classroom is not always a safe space governed by reasonable dialogue. Further, what might seem reasonable to some is considered epistemically violent to others. Drawing on Gayatri Spivak, epistemic violence is the privileging of a single dominant epistemic position, which consequently dominates narrative and ontological landscapes and institutional structures, including education. To paraphrase Graham, when one way of knowing is privileged, violence soon follows. Harris raises the following question: how did Lipman fail to see his own cultural embeddedness? One possible answer is colonization. National identity in colonial countries is, after all, perpetuated by cultural assumptions rooted in colonialism and its denial of Indigenous sovereignty. Decolonization, next slide, as Tuck and Yang point out in the quote, is often thrown around in educational context or assimilated into other narratives of oppression. The following passage is particularly salient. When we write about decolonization, we're not offering it as a metaphor. It is not an approximation of other experiences of oppression. To understand decolonization as more than a metaphor, we must first understand colonization as ongoing. As Patrick Wolf put it, colonization destroys to replace. It's not a system or an event, and it is an ongoing epistemically and physically violent structural project that is embedded in colonial countries, infused into our very ways of knowing, being, and doing, destroying to replace Indigenous ways of knowing, being, and doing. So what does this mean in terms of a critique of Lipman's work, as Gil has outlined? Well, to fulfill its potential as an approach to democratic education, philosophy for children must engage students in social critique. Moreover, it must go beyond the epistemic, beyond solely ways of knowing, to reconstruct experiences of being and doing in colonial countries. This movement, or reconstruction, to use Dewey's terminology, often requires educators to question their own worldviews, to become critical of the systems that gave rise to them. Following the work of Graham, we hold that questioning ingrained notions of place is an essential place to start. The school classroom is often the assumed site of education, but as Gil outlined, this assumption is in itself problematic and limiting. Next slide. Place, according to the Aboriginal view, is more than merely a location. For many Indigenous cultures, social justice is intertwined with place, conceived of as land, and land with notions of care for country. Many Indigenous scholars, therefore, emphasize place-responsive pedagogies, embedded pedagogies that create educational opportunities to understand the physical, cultural, and ethical complexity of place. Place-responsive pedagogies can enable students to develop an epistemic understanding of their being in the world and the reciprocal relationship between their belief habits and the construction of their habitat. That is, a much greater understanding of their identity in relation to place. Next slide. Along with an understanding of the needs and value of place beyond the economic. And there's a twofold importance here. The first is that the inclusion of Indigenous philosophical perspectives and worldviews in political issues and in education is necessary to address forms of epistemic violence resulting from colonization. The second is the recentering of an ethic that sees land as more than purely instrumental and thereby sets limits to exploitation. By bringing together Western and Indigenous discourses and worldviews in conversation, we can create educational opportunities to reconstruct socio-political experiences regarding human relationships with place. In this sense, place-responsive pedagogies embody Dewey's vision of education as a process of living, not a preparation for future living, a deliberative land-based social justice pedagogy that is both experiential and experimental. By the same token, the incorporation of critical Indigenous pedagogy and land education can be seen as a forebearer to Dewey's vision.
Thank you.
Thank you, Simone and Jill. So now we listen to Alina.
Thank you. I'm going to discuss a chapter written in collaboration with Nadia Kennedy. She wasn't able to be here today, but she's with us in spirit, so I'm going to present her part. I'm an educational psychologist and I do my research in language arts classroom, and Nadia is a math educator. So our chapter was an effort to build bridges across different disciplines and philosophy in an attempt to solve complex pedagogical problems that require this cross-disciplinary collaboration. Next, thank you. So in the chapter, we begin by tracing the development of Lipman's thinking to the original writings of pragmatist philosophers, something that Maughn talked about as well. We also highlight the ways in which Lipman departed from the earlier thinkers, such as in his formulation of community of inquiry as a pedagogical setting, and his use of a relatively free-form philosophical discussion. Next, we discuss the ways in which Lipman relied on the influential propositions of sociocultural theorists in psychology to design Philosophy for Children program. Here, for example, we talk about Lipman's use of Vygotskian concept of meta-level consciousness to propose an important distinction between procedural and substantive thinking, which became one of the essential organizing principles of philosophy for children pedagogy. Next, please. We then focus on 3 selected contemporary topics in education. They include epistemic cognition, dialogic pedagogy, and teacher professional development. And we discussed these topics in relation to Lipman's scholarship. And although it is hard to determine whether there is a direct causal link between Lipman's writing and current developments on these topics, we believe it is useful to examine what we now understand about several important constructs and mechanisms discussed by Lipman. For example, epistemic cognition, or the ways in which people think about knowledge construction, justification, and change, is a concept that is now considered to be highly influential in people's ability to process information and develop new understandings. And this concept of epistemic cognition is analogous to Lipman's notions of reflective and procedural thinking, as these notions describe people's meta-level awareness of cultural cognitive tools such as criteria, standards, strategies, and procedures that support the construction of knowledge. Also, in line with Lipman's proposals, contemporary research describes such higher order thinking as the primary goal of education and suggests that classroom instruction should prioritize extensive and collaborative engagement in epistemic cognition, meaning discussing the ways of producing and justifying and constructing knowledge. Next slide. In the final part of the chapter, we present 2 examples of our own work that support teacher and student learning through dialogue, in which we relied on the original and recent Philosophy for Children scholarship to design, implement, and evaluate instructional interventions in our respective disciplines. I conduct my research in language arts, and as I said, Nadia does her work in mathematics classroom. So we'll talk about this different context next. So here's an example of a research project in which we aimed to support teacher learning of facilitation skills to promote argumentation during discussions of controversial issues raised by text read by elementary school students. As part of this project, we developed a measurement and instructional tool, which is a 6-point rating scale used to assess the quality of teacher facilitation and student argumentation during dialogue. In developing of this tool, we relied heavily on Lipman's concept of reflective and procedural thinking and his distinctions between procedural and substantive teacher intervention. Next, please. Here's just an example. And switching now to the research conducted in mathematics classrooms, Nadia Kennedy used the principles developed by Lipman to propose a framework for philosophical inquiry in mathematics, which includes 3 types of inquiries. The first is philosophical inquiry that explores questions related to mathematical concepts, the nature of mathematics, the power of mathematical knowledge in describing, understanding, and predicting phenomena, and also its limitations and impact on individuals and society. Next, please. And in the second type is philosophical inquiries into typical textbook math problems. And this type aims to problematize the simple and narrow frame of a situation described by a textbook, typically in a word problem. It investigates assumptions and explores how considering different assumptions about the situation described in the problem might change the outcomes and mathematical calculations and procedures. And next, please. And the third inquiry is the philosophical inquiries into real situations described mathematically. So this category engages in problematizing mathematical models as accurate and objective representations of a situation and as products of mathematical abstraction. Such inquiries may facilitate understanding that different criteria may be at play in judging the success of modeling in math, and the value judgment may also prioritize one model over another. Next. So to conclude, several decades ago, Lipman proposed a radical reconstruction of the educational aims and processes and developed philosophy for children approach that he himself called the Great Experiment. And today, Philosophy for Children represents one of many educational programs centered around inquiry and dialogue. And we have numerous studies documenting benefits of participating in dialogue for student learning with learning outcomes that range from reasoning to argumentative writing to inferential comprehension of text, as well as conceptual understanding of disciplinary concept and principles across the school subjects. At the same time, many essential questions about the goals, mechanisms, outcomes, and classroom implementations of dialogic pedagogy remain unanswered today, and they continue to inspire theoretical and empirical work. And Philosophy for Children scholarship, including Lipman's writing and the works published more recently, is well positioned to inform this ongoing search for more effective use of dialogue to address various pressing educational priorities. The contributions of Philosophy for Children scholars have made to formalizing theoretical and pedagogical knowledge related to orchestrating intellectually rigorous and engaging dialogue in a classroom is invaluable for educational researchers like me, who often lack background in philosophy and don't have a formal training in understanding the norms, standards, and practices of argumentation. So, for example, in my recent work on using artificial intelligence to simulate student avatar dialogues that could be used to support teacher learning of facilitation skills, I again am drawing heavily on Philosophy for Children, and I collaborate with different scholars and practitioners to help me get insight into theoretical and philosophical foundations of the work that underlines dialogue in the classroom. Thank you. This is the end for me.
Thank you so much, Alina. You are wonderful with the time, everyone. Thank you so much. I have this not easy task. Okay, so let's listen to Stefano. Looking forward to it, Stefano.
I fear that I will not so good. So will be so good. So Walter, you will need to use your balloons. Good. I don't know what to say because here in Italy it is late in the evening. So for me it is good night, but okay, good morning or good something. And I'm going to speak about the chapter on Matthew Lipman as an educational reformer. And I have to acknowledge Maughn and Megan for proposing me this topic. And I wanted to acknowledge them because I was really unaware of how important the question of better, the thematization of educational reform was in Lipman's thinking. So, of course, I knew that he was an educational reformer, but I was unaware, or at least I hadn't realized how much he had reflected also on educational reform. In this sense, please move on the first slide. In this sense, Lipman thematized a distinction between the innovation of the curriculum and educational reform. And he always, at least in the interpretation proposed in the book,
he always insisted on philosophy for children being essentially educational reform and not simply an innovation of the curriculum. So innovation of the curriculum would be just a curricular reform, just adding philosophy in the among the topics of schooling. Perhaps this should have been could have been a major curricular reform in US, but for example, who had not represented any really important reform in Italy, because philosophy is part and parcel of high school, upper high school curriculum. But Lipman didn't want just to include one more subject matter, important as it is, into the curriculum. He wanted, he made a stronger claim. He made the claim that in letting school philosophy go to school implied remaking the foundation of the schooling. In this sense, philosophy for children aimed at a complete curricular redesign, and therefore an educational reform, and not simply in adding one more subject matter. And this is, in my opinion, crucial to understand the whole undertaking of Matthew Lipman, because he wanted to promote a major shift in education, and in his understanding this was linked with the transition from tribal education to an education underpinned and sustained by thinking. In this sense, we, in my opinion, we should also interpret the idea that Lipman was a pioneer in philosophy for children. This is worldwide recognized. But the fact that he wasn't just someone who said, okay, we can do philosophy for with children, but he said, if we do philosophy with children, we will be able to make the school in the entire school in another way. Please, Maughn, in the next slide. Indeed, what is most remarkable in Lipman's undertaking is his comprehensiveness. Lipman was in the mid 70s. Lipman was not the only one to experiment with philosophy for children. There is a special issue in metaphilosophy in which Matthew Lipman's philosophy for children is one of the experience. But what characterized Lipman's endeavor from the very beginning was the broadness of his endeavor, namely adding philosophy to the curriculum, but as I have already said, in order to remake the foundation of education, then the invention of a new curriculum. So the attempt, the endeavor to devise new ways to bring philosophy to school, and thirdly, an awareness of the fact that if we make philosophy the center of schooling, we need to reinvent and to revamp also teachers' education. So it was not. It was a sort of multi-sided endeavor, and not just a one-sided endeavor. Please, Moon, the next. On the historical viewpoint, we can see this broadness also has the consequence that Lipman operated at the hinge of two educational eras and consciously attempted to establish a bridge between these two eras. On one hand, he is clearly, as all my fellow panelists have highlighted, he is a creative heir of the tradition of educational pragmatism. But interestingly enough, he was an heir of the Deweyan project and not simply of progressive education and what pragmatism had become in some experience. By the way, those experiences criticized by Hannah Arendt in The Crisis of Education. At the same time, Lipman was not against the new enterprise of Brunner. And there is this quote at the end of this slide from Lipman that for me has always sounded very, very stimulating. From Dewey, it is only one step to Jérôme's Brunner's contention and so on. It is it has always sounded very, very stimulating because in my cultural area, as a book of Brunner was very, very important that was translated into Italian as Dopo Dewey, after Dewey, as if Brunner were a somebody who wanted to go beyond Dewey. So instead, Lipman, by the way, with the typical pragmatist move, creates a transition where others see a dichotomy. And he tried to complement the strengths of Dewey and the strengths of Brunner. And the link is precisely provided by philosophy in education, because philosophy is a discipline, and this is the Brunner, but Brunner legacy, which, however, is approached as a style of inquiry, and this is the Deweyan level. Of course, then Lipman made many other steps, but I cannot do any longer apart from the next slide, saying that what is living and what is dead of Lipman's endeavor. Living is that his emphasis on thinking is more important than ever in our struggle for intelligence, to tell it with Bernard Stiegler, and with the new challenges of artificial intelligence. Of course, there are also some weaknesses, some problems in Lipman's legacy. Some of them have already been discussed by Simone and Gilles, and also Maughn. And I will just see one word on the third point, namely, what about the fact that perhaps the ideas itself of educational reform is problematic? And I think of Thomas Popkiewicz saying that educational reform was the typical phrase of the 20th century, but it was allied to the idea of produce a certain kind of human being. And perhaps this may be still something to be discussed. Thank you so much.
Grazie. Thank you so much, Stefano, and everyone for such precise and thoughtful and I would say provocative interventions. As a responder, I have thought about offering one question to each of you, one question as a response to each presentation. So to Mon and Megan, thanking for this very, very clear panorama of the influences, teaching experiences, biography, formation of Matthew Lipman. I was wondering, remembering Michel Foucault's last distinction between two ways of philosophy in his last courses in the College of France, Foucault says that there are basically two ways of understanding philosophy. Philosophy as a system of thought, as a theory, and philosophy as a way of life. And I wonder where you would put Lipman, and if this distinction is meaningful to understand Lipman's thinking, or if we need to make it a little more complex. And so, Mark, thank you so much also for your precise comments on Lipman's relation to logic and critical thinking. And the question that emerged to me is that there's a tension I see, and I would like you to help me understand and how you would think this tension, and if you think it's a real tension, between logic on the one side, as if philosophy as logic looks like the discipline of thinking. But on the other side, philosophy as a critique of the social thinking, the dominant social thinking, in a sense, it looks like the indiscipline of thinking. So it seems that philosophy have two dimensions, that it cannot give up to any of those, as discipline of thinking, as undiscipline of thinking. How would you connect both, or do you think that this distinction is meaningful and you can help to think the relationship between them? Gilbert and Simone, thank you so much, because you brought so many fundamental, important, and very, very meaningful elements to understand the philosophy for children and some limits and some critiques. And my question is very, very direct and simple. How would it look like a decolonized philosophy for children? How would you affirm? Of course, this is a very complex issue, but just some few elements, which are the things that should not be absent of a decolonized, at least, philosophy for children approach. So what do we need to have a decolonized philosophy for children? Just trying to phrase it differently. Alina and Nadia, absent and present. Thank you so much also. I would like to, in a certain way, to connect you with Gilbert and Simone, in the sense that Gilbert and Simone spoke about epistemic bias and epistemic violence, and you spoke about epistemic cognition, and mostly about how the different ways of producing and justifying knowledge. So what would you say about those ways of producing knowledge that are systematically or structurally excluded from the dominant ways of producing knowledge? What would you say about the topic of epistemic bias and violence raised by Simone and Gilbert, trying to, in a sense, connect we or you? Stefano, thank you so much. And in the end, you also posed some questions that I would like to make mine. But there's specifically one phrase that you mentioned from Lipman, saying, if we do philosophy for children, we can do school in a completely different way. And I wonder how, because it seems like it's a circle. So because to do philosophy for children really or truly, we need a different school. But to have a different school, Lipman thought that we need to do philosophy for children. But if we do philosophy for children in the actual school with all the problems that this institutional school has, how are we going to really do philosophy for children? So isn't that a kind of, this phrase isn't kind of idealistic in a sense, or romantic, or how would you think? How can you help us to think that phrase? So hope to have helped us to continue thinking, and thank you so much for everyone.
Wow, thanks, Walter. Those are really penetrating questions. And I just want to say first, on behalf of Megan and myself, thanks to everyone involved in this project. Just listening to this again, I'm very gratified that we have this quality of thinking going on. And I'm really, it strikes me that we're celebrating Matthew Lipman's life and work on the one hand, but we're also critiquing, which is a way of honoring and taking it seriously, finding problems and asking new questions. And that's very gratifying to me. I'll just say one little thing about Walter's question to Megan and me about philosophy as a way of life versus as a discipline. I do think it's a helpful distinction, but I also think that Matt and also Anne thought that you needed both. You needed philosophy as both. And I'm thinking in particular about something that Matt took from Justice Buckler, another thing he took from Buckler, which is the idea that judgments, that everything we do is a judgment. Everything we think, everything we say and make, and even a gesture is a judgment. And judgments are not, we shouldn't think of them as expressions. Like, I'm a human being and I go around expressing myself by making all kinds of judgments. Rather, he said that the world extracts judgments from us. They compel us. They sort of pull them out of us because of the situations we find ourselves in. He said, for Buckler, it was nature. He said, nature compels, extracts judgments from human beings. And pedagogically, that's really important for Matt. He said, in one place, Matt says, we don't teach children principles of logic and thinking and then ask them to apply them in a situation. He said, we put them into a situation that's provocative, and it provokes and extracts that kind of thinking from them. And then we can follow along behind and say, did you know that thing you just did is called this kind of inference, or this kind of, what you did was just use a criterion or something like that may help them or not. But initially, it's just the experience itself, the community of inquiry, the stimulus materials that extract from them. And Anne once said that if you want to know the ultimate bottom line purpose of philosophy, of doing philosophy the way we do it, is to live, she said, a qualitatively better life, by which she meant more just, more beautiful, et cetera, et cetera. But they did believe that the discipline of philosophy as a process, as a procedure, was instrumental to living a better life. It's this kind of meta-reflection and doing it in a community and a community of peers that has different points of view was necessary to improving life. That's all I'll say. Megan, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, thanks, Maughn, and thanks, everyone. Just want to echo what Maughn said. It is very gratifying to finally sit here and be together and hear people speaking about their chapters. In response to your question, Walter, I would also say both, but I would stress less the influence of Buckler, but not that that isn't there, but one way that has helped me think about that question is to appreciate how much philosophy for children had its origins in general or liberal education. And so I think that's really important for stressing that both we need philosophy as a sort of a discipline that collects together the history of theories that constitutes it. But in liberal education, at least, the stress is on your exposure to those theories, not necessarily with a view to mastering them, but with a view to integrating them into your life so that you can live a better life, as Maughn was saying. And it's not limited to philosophy. He had that same interest about visual arts, literature, and of course, within a broader liberal education, you would be interested in economics and sociology, which points to what Simone and Gil were talking about. But I also think because of the emphasis in liberal education on this discussion method as a way of thinking and being together, it does lend itself to thinking of philosophy as a way of life. And so for me, it was an exciting discovery to find out that Matthew Lipman was a professor of philosophy, but also a professor of general or liberal education, and thinking about what that means and what it means to bring it to younger children.
Thank you, Megan. Thank you, Maughn. Thank you so much. Should we listen, Mark, on discipline or indiscipline of thinking?
You know, it's interesting for me to listen to you people from different parts of the world, given the fact that I'm going to be 85 years old next week. The fact that I'm living in America now, and I experienced living in America for 11 years when I worked in the schools, where I had probably the longest and most successful philosophy for children program that I know of. For 11 years, I worked with hundreds and hundreds of teachers in a place called Middle Village, Queens. Middle Village, Queens was the district in New York City that sued the Board of Education because they introduced a book called Heather Has Two Mommies. And that was after 10 years of the most successful philosophy for children program that I know of in New York City. And when the superintendent who supported me for those 11 years stopped being superintendent, within an eye blink, the district reverted to being an extraordinarily middle class, upper working class neighborhood, extremely conservative, extremely homophobic. And so I have this incredibly jaundiced view that has now been reinforced by the fact that in the United States of America, diversity, equity, and inclusion are now considered to be liable to criminal, institutionally oriented destruction of major universities. That's what I got to say.
Thank you, Mark. And now Simone and Gilbert.
Thanks, Walter. That's an incredibly difficult and complex question. But I think part of what we talked about in the presentation and in the chapter goes some way towards answering it, and that is starting with place. There's not one, just as Mary would say, that there's not one logic, not one way of thinking, not one way of being in the world. There's definitely not one answer to that question, right? So depending on where we are in the world and the specifics of that location and the history and culture and environment, the answer will differ. And so I think that, you know, emphasis on starting with place and the needs of place is really important. Also doing away with the colonial bias against nature. So that's something that is very, you know, pervasive, this idea that we are somehow separate from the natural world and that it's just there for our use and extraction of material wealth. Rather than something that is, you know, an entity that has some kind of personhood or some sort of spiritual dimension to it that we can engage with. I think that is a very important part of the decolonial process. It's also further complicated by, you know, it's Tuck and Yang says a certain incommensurability, right, to the project. As a non-Indigenous scholar, that's the part that I think I come up against and struggle with, is that appreciation that I need to dialogue and understand that worldview as best I can, but that there will always be some sort of a gap in my lived experience of the world versus other people's lived experience of the world. So, and that's where I think pragmatism and the importance of fallibility come into play, and the importance of reconstruction of self and environment, and reconstruction of the community of inquiry as well.
I just wanted to quickly add to that, to link to Maughn's idea where Lipman says you've got to put yourself in the situation. And I think a better word for that is to put yourself in place. And if we recognise we are in place, and we are in that Julian sense of place where the human, the organism, and the environment is a continuity, not a separation. When we put ourselves in place, we always got to recognise, as Simone says, when it's what's getting colonised is place. So the moment we see that, we see the strata of colonisation. You know, like and what's that one in Dakota again? Where the mountain was chiseled with the
Mount Rushmore.
Mount Rushmore, right? Just very quickly, if you can see the past, Mount Rushmore is a classic case of colonisation. When you see what were Indigenous people thinking, what was happening as it was built, then when you see it finished, and now you're seeing it in its final, very touristy attraction thing, I think you can look at place there and start to ask, where do we start with decolonisation? I think it's a good example in the US for that one, and put Mr. Trump there.
It sounds very meaningful. We have the expression to put something in place, but it seems that you are saying we need to put place in something. So instead of putting philosophy in place, we need to put place in philosophy. Is that right?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay. Thank you so much. What about Alina? What do you think about the epistemic dimension?
Thank you. I'm kind of out of my out of place, I guess, here as an educational psychologist. I'm not a philosopher. So for me, terms like epistemic violence are difficult to engage with. They're abstract. They, to me, sound emotionally charged, dramatized, and I believe difficult to operationalize. So my question back to, because you asked me to engage with Simone and Gilbert, and my question back to them is to ask to sort of the question you had, Walter, to make it more concrete, like what specifically, I would like to know like a specific facilitation practice that you think is commonly used by well-intentioned philosophy for children facilitator that is consistent with the writing, let's say, of Lipman, and that is, in your understanding, is committing this epistemic violence. Like, I would like to see an example of something that should be excluded. We can always add new things, but let's, if the proposition is that philosophy for children as currently practiced is epistemically violent, I would like to see very concrete examples of that for me to be able to work with that concept in any meaningful way.
Okay, so Simone and Jill, your microphone is open to listen to examples.
Yeah, thank you. So I don't think it's as simple as just sort of pointing to one kind of example and saying, you know, that's what we should not do. Because it's more of a critique, and in philosophy, it is a fairly widespread critique made by, you know, critical race theorists, feminists, critical Indigenous scholars, that there is this kind of separation, at least in the Western tradition, of logic and emotion. And that logic is not this thing that is separated off from, right, emotion, that it is pervasive, that those two things are porous, right? We rely on emotion to make judgments. And so that sort of idea is something that is itself kind of a Western bias, I think. So what I suppose we're pointing to is a wider critique of philosophy in general, and the ways that that has kind of seeped into the community of inquiry.
Yeah, can I just quickly add to that with an example? In Lipman's book, when he often talks about logic, we get this particular type of thinking. So, for example, if he talks about freedom in Mark novels, we talk about freedom, and there seems to be kind of like a particular logic going with there's an assumption already behind a particular history of liberal thinking on what freedom and autonomy means. But if we were to talk to Australian Aboriginal people, we see something quite different, the notion of autonomous regard. There is no dualism there. What does autonomy mean? Well, it's not about just autonomy, because at the same time you have autonomous regard. That links to a lot of European thinking in the notion of the kind of continental philosophers. But what we don't talk about is, okay, there's precursors to that, and they're Indigenous people. And when we're colonizing, that's what's often missing. It's basically, well, okay, if we're going to talk about colonizing, how many countries have been colonized? Well, in Australia, the British, and we all know who's colonized each other's countries. So that's already a starting point for me to say, if we've ignored that, the novels don't have it, then we got to look at that and say, well, there's some epistemic thing missing. And violence meaning basically just another form of harm that happens epistemically but has ontological consequences. And I think that's the important thing. It's not just epistemic because it gets manifests its institutional practices, and that's the slide that happens. So,
Thank you, Jill.
But a very good question, Alina.
Can I jump in and just add one thing? I think something Simone was saying in response about emotion, I think it echoes some of what Steve Williams says in his chapter on the curricular philosophical novel, in that he says he criticizes Lipman for not making the novels more rhetorical, and by that he includes expressions of emotion, like strong expressions of emotion, even like physical expressions of emotion, and also like letters and storytelling, witnessing, these kinds of things that are not necessarily typically sort of standard reasoning moves, at least in the Lipman model. So Steve is calling for an expansion of what it means to dialogue to include like physical demonstrations of witnessing and storytelling and expressions of emotion.
Thank you, Mom. Unfortunately, we are very short of time, very, very short, but we need to listen to Alina and Stefano also, because, Mom, we need to finish in 3 minutes, right?
Yeah, the other sessions that I have been on at this conference, they have gone over time. Like they don't cut you off. They're not going to come in and cut you off. So I don't.
Okay,
people can stay around a few more minutes. I think that would be great.
Great. So also Mark was wanting to say something.
Well, but my recent work has been trying to understand brain science. And my understanding of brain science is that logic is based upon emotions. And there is no way to divert the emotional impact, but that doesn't mean that you can say that the emotions of indigenous people are more or less deeply rooted in human psyche than the emotions of, I don't know, I'll pick my favorite example, Donald Trump. I mean, he is a ball of meaningless, illogical emotions determining every one of our actions in the United States at this moment in time. So how do you choose which emotional basis you want to use? And that becomes the problem, because there is no such thing as clean logic. And one of the problems with Lipman's using baby logic is he completely ignores the fact that logicians have been criticizing logic all through the 20th century, and there is no consensus whatsoever as to what the format of logic is or could be. So, I mean, I just see this thing as devoid of an appreciation of the human condition as I experience it as an 85-year-old living in an upper middle class society that is now being transformed by a group of people who are bringing up the centrality of ideas that we all thought died a long time ago. And I wonder about you optimistic Australians, what you're going to do when Donald Trump or his analog takes over Australia the way Donald Trump and his analog took over Brazil for about half a decade. So, place, right? Place. That's all I want to say.
Thank you, Mark. Alina, do you want to respond to Simone and Jill?
Yeah, just a quick note that in very Western contemporary educational psychology, epistemic emotions are widely considered to be an important part of reasoning processes, and there are numerous articles about this, so it's not like this is missing. And so just
Okay, so there's so much. It seems we are beginning in each topic. We are just beginning, but it's nice to have this feeling that there's a lot to think about. Stefano, it's your turn.
Okay. I will start from your suggestion that it could be idealistic. Yes, perhaps. Also in the chapter, I take seriously the possibility that Lipman's endeavor was Hecotic and that he was Socratic in the sense of Aristophanes, namely is saying in the cloud. So there is this risk. And in some respects, there are some statements of Lipman that show that he seemed to think that there was a sort of arch of history going towards the better and passing from tribal education to democratic education. And things seems not to have gone that way. And in this sense, we should take seriously the idea, okay, perhaps Lipman's bet has been lost. And what to do? I would say Lipman's bet was the idea that of dramatization of philosophy into acceptation. First, dramatizing philosophy, and namely to make it dramatic through novels and so on. But then that philosophy dramatize schools so that it can transform the school. Now, it could be idealistic, but at the same time, it could be a compass for what Gramsci would call a fight to establish a different common sense, a different educational common sense. I suppose that in your question there was also a matter which is a matter of strategy in the Gramscian meaning of the word, namely that we need to fight to establish a new common sense with the awareness that the major risk is that most of Lipman's achievements can be appropriated, and in many cases have been appropriated by the power. If one reads the most recent educational policy documents, they are all about critical thinking, dialogic conversation, and so we need to conduct, to fare this war for new meanings, to reappropriate meanings, invent perhaps new metaphors, but in this sense, it is something that Lipman did himself when he invented the new metaphors. And so perhaps we will be all the more heirs to Lipman, all the more we are able to invent new metaphors for a new educational common sense.
Thank you, Stefanos. Thank you so much. I just want to because you say now an expression that you repeat that you said before, but when you first said it in your intervention, I was not sure. I thought maybe it's my ear, but now you repeated it, and I think it's a great example of what we were discussing before. That you say that Lipman, this passage from tribal education to democratic education. And I wonder how Simone and Jill were listening to this, because this seems also, Alina, a very precise example of how this epistemic bias seems to be crossing philosophy for children and even Lipman proposal. So this use of tribal as something naive, as something that is like a child at the beginning, and that might be through philosophy for children turned into a democratic education. So see where this this term, this conception, and how we might say that this is something that Derrida said in one of his seminars on the right to philosophy. So he says about the infinite task of decolonizing our own thinking. So I think that if something I learned from here is that that we are at the beginning of something that it's, and I think that I could say that philosophy for children, and we as members of this community, we need to decolonize our own thinking, like vigilant of the way we speak and think. So I don't know if someone else wants to say something. We have passed.
Walter, I would love to hear just a little more from you.
From me?
Yes. You've asked wonderful questions, but I would also like to just hear from you what are some of your impressions or what you're thinking about Matthew Lipman's legacy.
I'm sorry, I just want to say I have to run. It was a pleasure. Thank you for organizing it. I don't want to just leave, but thank you.
Thanks,
but
Alina.
Please answer the question because I can watch the video and see what you said. So
thank you so much.
Thanks.
Well, thank you so much, Maughn. I was not prepared in the sense that I thought that my task here was more to listen and to make. But I also think personally, and also related to what you say about both dimensions of philosophy, for me, Matthew Lipman has been an extraordinary encounter, both personally and also about the way I saw and I related to philosophy. I could say there's some point before and after the encounter with Lipman and Sharp also, and all the community of philosophy for children. Matthew Lipman, I think, to all that have connected deeply with his work, has been also an opportunity to begin a new way of thinking and practicing philosophy, and a new way to relating to childhood, to relate it to education. And I think his extraordinary value is that of a founder, of someone who has divided waters, and who has made people who have engaged with him couldn't relate anymore to philosophy, to education, and to childhood the way they have related before. So my feeling is of thankful, of gratitude, and someone who being in touch with helps me permanently to do this decolonizing task that I was referring before. So in a sense, it's like what some people we call, it's like a childhood of philosophy. It's like looking at childhood not only or not mainly as an object or as something to be educated, but as something that educates us, and something that if we listen, we need to be always more close to the beginning than to the end. To be with this idea that, like now, that we are ending this conversation, but we have the feeling that we are still beginning to think, and there's so much to think and to live together.
That's beautiful.
So thank you so much to all, and I really think that this conversation has showed also that how many different ways there are to relate to Lipman and to philosophy for children, and how he has, in a sense, opened like a new world for many people, for many ways to inhabiting or to put philosophy in place, as Jill said. And I think also that usually when you question me, Mon, about what do I think, sometimes also I think that this has to do with the relationship between form and matter, or form and content, that usually in education, and this is also to the two dimensions of philosophy, because one dimension of philosophy as theory or system has much to do with content, while the other of philosophy as form of life has much to do with form. And I think that also my relationship to Lipman is also in the form that we have been relating, and I have been trying to connect to your thinking, and in this form that has to do with the commitment to questions, and to always be more sensitive to the questioning dimension of thinking than to the answering dimension. Again, because questions are beginning of thinking. So when we live in questions, we are more close to the beginning. And thank you for being together this day.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Walter. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
We'll be in touch very soon about the book and about this recording.
Thank you so much.
Hope we can get together again to celebrate. And thank you especially, I just want to say to Gil and Simone, who got up at 5 o'clock to begin this, and to Stefano, who stayed up until after 10 o'clock p.m. in Italy to do this for us. So thank you especially.
Thank you so much.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. And